All right, so I am showing 10 a.m. Central Time right now, so we can go ahead and get started. Wanted to say hello and thank you to everyone for attending our virtual town hall, 20 years later, Municipal Emerald Ash Borer Management and Saving Public Ash Trees for a Sustainable Future. This webinar is being co-hosted by Rainbow Ecoscience and Society of Municipal Arborists. We have a really exciting lineup here today of some great speakers to talk to you, and I'm excited to introduce them to you later on. But before we dive into the talks, wanted to go ahead and start off with a safety brief. And one of the core values at Rainbow Ecoscience is safety. So before we begin, we always complete a quick safety brief to remind ourselves of our safety protocols. Please make sure to check your surroundings for any trip hazards, such as cords or bags. And we have attendees from all over the country and actually a couple that are outside of the United States. So please be aware of any inclement weather in your area. Additionally, if you are in a vehicle, please make sure that you're parked in a safe location and are able to listen. So one of the things I wanted to start off with is, for some of you who may not be familiar with us, we actually underwent a brand refresh. And so on November 1st, 2021, Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements announced that it has changed its name to Rainbow Ecoscience. And our new name reflects the company's purpose that started in arboriculture and now includes products and protocols that encompass the entire green industry. We started our research and development division in 1997 with just 2 products that protected trees from deadly diseases. We saw a need to invest in practical research that produced predictable results, something that was lacking in the tree care industry at the time. And so today we bring that same innovation to landscape maintenance professionals, municipal foresters, electric utilities, nursery and greenhouse growers, government land managers, and many other green markets. The new Rainbow Ecoscience name expresses our dedication to the care of entire urban ecosystems. Additionally, wanted to talk a little bit about Society of Municipal Arborists as well. They were founded in 1964. It's an organization for municipal arborists and urban foresters throughout the world. And the mission that Society of Municipal Arborists is about is to build confidence, competence, and camaraderie of professionals who manage trees and forests to create and sustain more livable communities. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can visit their website located below. So to dive into things, first in front of you, my name is Eric Lindberg. I'm our lead technical advisor at Rainbow Ecoscience. A couple of things that I do, I assist in emerald ash borer management plan development for municipalities and government entities. Additionally, I do training and education on a variety of plant healthcare protocols, answer technical questions, provide product and equipment support, as well as in the field support and application training. A little bit more into my background. I got a bachelor's degree in ecology and environmental biology from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and then moved south and got a master's degree in biology with an emphasis in forest ecology from Texas Tech University, where I did research on bark beetles and pine trees. Also a licensed pesticide applicator in the state of Minnesota. So wanted to go over a quick housekeeping slide. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type that into the Q&A box using the control panel, and we'll answer them at the end. We are recording this webinar and it will be available afterwards. So you will receive an email with a link to view it. Finally, this webinar is worth 4 ISA CEUs. If you did not enter or don't remember if you entered your ISA certification number during the registration, you can go ahead and type that into the Q&A box right now, and we'll make sure that you get your CEUs. So last thing with this is the agenda that we have going on today. And please note that all times are in Pacific time. The first talk that we'll have is the science of EAB and why it matters for municipalities. That'll be with Allison Harrell with Rainbow Ecoscience. Then we will have the ashability of emerald ash borer management using a sustainability lens with Richard Howard, professor of urban forestry out of the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Then we're going to have a 10-minute break after that talk. We'll go ahead and keep everything up, but we'll step away for a little bit. And following that, we will have comprehensive approach to EAB management, private and public. And this will be done by Ryan Spencer from Rainbow Tree Care. And after that talk, we'll have one last 10-minute break. And then we will conclude with case studies with some unique city approaches to EAB management with a Q&A portion at the end. And this will be done with Maria Friges with the city of Shoreview, Joseph Hansen with the village of Wilmette, Illinois, and Michael Swanson with the city of Denver. So each one of them will present, and then we'll have a expanded Q&A portion at the end of that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Allison, who is going to be speaking on the science of EAB and why it matters for municipalities. So Allison Harrell is an arborologist with Rainbow Ecoscience. She provides plant healthcare protocol training and technical support for Rainbow's clients, landscape and arborist professionals all around the country. She holds a BA in biology with a minor in chemistry from Valparaiso University and an MS in environmental science from Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs. She is an ISA certified arborist, track holder, and pesticide applicator in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho with over 10 years of experience, including tree climbing, plant healthcare applications, research, education, and sales. Essentially a very credentialed person. So with that, I will go ahead and turn over the screen to Allison.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. And thank you everyone for being here. It looks like we've got a pretty good turnout. And I also do want to mention, whoops, that Matt Karst is working here in the background. So there are some chats coming through. That is not what I wanted. Sorry. We good? You got me, Eric?
Yep, I can see you.
Cool.
Perfect.
Thank you. I know we've been Zooming for a long time, yet there's always a few little hiccups here and there. So let me just move your face.
Allison, you just muted yourself.
All right, cool. I was trying to move your face and I muted myself. All right, awesome. So thank you, Eric. Eric will be moderating the chat here and there. And also, Eric, feel free to just interject if there's anything that comes up along the way. Otherwise, I will take questions. And then I'm here until 9 just to check on the time, right?
Correct.
Okay, perfect. All right. So again, like Eric said, I'm the arborologist with Rainbow Ecoscience. I am based out of Portland, Oregon, but I am a relatively new transplant to the West Coast. I spent the majority of my time in Chicagoland. So I did all of my school in Indiana and then spent about 8 years in Chicagoland, mostly dealing with emerald ash borer stuff, working for a tree care company. So I'm going to talk about that in this presentation, but basically here to talk to you about a little bit of background on the science of EAB and then kind of some in the field experience as to why this matters for municipalities and anyone here who's not from a municipality. I think you'll also find this pretty interesting. So going to talk about life cycle biology and history of EAB, just a tiny bit out of obligation for those of you who, I don't know, maybe you're newer arborists. So anybody who's been an arborist in the last 20 years has heard about EAB, but if you're new, just a quick highlight. Basic overview of the toolbox approach and treatment methods that we've kind of discovered, and then some practical concerns and impacts of EAB. I'm going to talk about my time, I'm calling it from the trenches, but where we were at the time in, I don't know, 12 plus years ago through now, and what it was like being on the tree removal crews for ashes as a plant healthcare tech, as well as some opportunities to discuss what it was like being a consulting sales arborist, go over some municipal case studies that I was kind of involved in, though we'll hear more about that later. And then the highlights of kind of then versus now. So what is EAB? You guys know it's this really beautiful, shiny green beetle. It's this invasive flat-headed borer. It's a Gryllus planopennis. It's got this beautiful emerald green color. They're, pretty small, but identifiably large. So 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, you can certainly see them. And their life cycle revolves around the ash tree, which I'll show you. How it mostly ends up spreading. Adults are able to fly up to 2 miles, though typically it is much less than that, especially if the nearest food source is less than 2 miles away, which it often is because we got a lot of ash trees, or we did at least, but in some areas we still have a lot of ash trees left. New infestations are often found near campgrounds. A lot of this has to do with because of the way it spreads through movement of firewood, nursery stock, and ash waste products. So those larvae or those beetles can be in those wood piles or in those products and then get moved by people, the biggest pests of all. This is just a graphic that I always show because it's pretty funny. This is why the Don't Move Firewood kind of campaign has become really important. We've moved so much emerald ash borer. It has expanded pretty far. This is the map. As you guys know, it was discovered in the very early 2000s, around 2002-ish. And then this is the latest map from 2021. So last year's map. I couldn't find the most recent update of the maps on the USDA website because they changed the format. But regardless, this is kind of the update. You all know, very, very heavy into the Midwest, started in the Ohio, Michigan areas, and then it's just expanded a ton since then. Most recently has been discovered as far as Texas, Louisiana, and Colorado. And we are just kind of waiting here on the West Coast to see if it makes it over the Front Range. My hunch is that it is only a matter of time. We've had a few Department of Agricultural inspections that have identified either dead emerald ash borer in vehicles in the West or live emerald ash borer. I believe there was a live emerald ash borer detected, but it was supposedly in an encapsulated vehicle. So anyway, if those few people have been identified, you know that there's more than that out there. So that's the green area here is the area where ashes survive and have populations. And then the red dots are where the ash borer exists. And I apologize if anyone here is colorblind. This is very difficult to see, but I did not create this map. So I just, apologies, my coworker has mentioned this to me before. Okay, so just a quick life cycle. EAB emerge around 400 growing degree days. That's in conjunction with the phenological indicator of the black locust bloom. There you can see starting to emerge. In mid-July, they lay their eggs. Then the larva develops and starts to feed through that sort of summertime through early fall. And then in the winter, they overwinter. And then they pupate in the early spring and then reemerge again. So that's the generalized life cycle. We don't need to get too deep into the details. We have actual experts coming through if you have more questions on this. Basically, though, the emerging adult beetles chew their way from under the bark. They create those tiny little D-shaped exit holes. You typically can see them. That's one of the symptoms of this. Please note that these are pretty small because the way the head is shaped, they're about 1/8 of an inch, and they've got that flat section and then a rounded part on the bottom. Remember, bugs don't know English, so it could be D-shaped, but it could also be any orientation as they emerge out. They zigzag underneath in these feeding tunnels. So if you remove some of that bark, you'll typically see these S-shaped feeding tunnels. You can see they got really tight hairpin turns as the larvae feed, and then they also grow with size. One indicator too is that those channels that are left behind do have excrement. They do have that frass in them. And so I like that because you can see when they're little, obviously their feeding is a lot smaller, but then they get pretty large. So you can have some very, very large feeding galleries. Woodpeckers are a pretty great indicator. They love to feed on EAB larvae. So the marks that they leave when they kind of scrape the bark to reach the larva are called flecks. And that's kind of considered a early warning sign. And that is the flecking standard pattern on the side of an ash. Some people say that this is what they are really utilizing to detect EAB, just because that's been so highly reported. Those vertical splits in the bark can appear above those larval feeding galleries. It kind of is like, they're calling it like a window into the tree. And actually the right picture I love, I think it's so interesting because you can see those feeding galleries, and then you can actually see where the tree is try to compartmentalize over that wounding. And then that's still that next layer, you can see more feeding on the external layer. And that's pretty classic in scenarios where we've got, you know, high volumes of EAB year after year. This is the canopy thinning that you'll typically see associated with emerald ash borer. But what I will say too is this can be a little tricky because canopy thinning can occur from other things, especially out here in the West. We do have, I'm especially thinking like Idaho, we've got a lot of, or even Eastern and Central Oregon, a lot of clear wing borer. So ash lilac borer can also show kind of similar canopy thinning symptoms. The good news is if you are getting on the wagon of treatment controls, the treatments that we have actually kill both clear wing borer as well as emerald ash borer. So you can get a little bit of a twofer, but we'll talk about that later. And then anyway, so we'll talk about this tree canopy. This is just kind of a sign, usually top down, the top starts to thin out, and then it'll kind of continue to decline over time. And this is because the beetles kind of fly into the top and start feeding and then work their way down. Purdue had put together these sort of canopy thinning cards for people to determine how far gone their trees were and recommendations around whether they should treat or not. So just kind of know that these resources exist for you. And our sort of going recommendation industry-wide is once it's at the 30% canopy dieback, it's going to be hard to get that tree turned around. That's more of a candidate for removal and replacement rather than treatment. Please note, symptoms can take a while to show up. So it can be too late to do anything once those symptoms show up. So you can see a tree looks fine, no thinning, but then year 2, you start to see a decent amount of thinning. And by 3 to 4, it's already pretty severe. And part of the reason is because the larvae start to feed in those branches. But as we know, trees don't show symptoms until, you know, a year or 2 later sometimes. I mean, and that's true with like construction damage, or if you had someone cut a large root, you know, the tree won't show symptoms of that for quite a while. And the same is true with that feeding component here. So you have to recognize that the way that it looks now, it's going to look worse the next year because you can't actively determine how much feeding is going on in that tree and what it's going to, you know, present itself the next year. Epicormic shoots, these are kind of a classic sort of last ditch effort for these trees as they compensate for leaf loss in the upper canopy, colloquially referred to as sprouts. We just see them a lot. I know that Dr. Howard is going to talk about this a little bit, but basically what it ends up being is that once an area gets infested, you have quite a long period before those symptoms start to like show up and ash trees actually start to die. So that first like 5 or 6 years, you typically don't see a lot of death, but then that death just goes exponentially as all of those trees start to get fed on, and then just all at once will start to die. And the reason that this is important is when you're thinking about from a management perspective. So, excuse me. You don't want to, I have a frog in my throat. All right, thanks. So we were at exponential death curve. Okay, so when you're thinking about management, if you don't do anything for the first 5 or 6 years, then all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of dead trees on your hands, which is really difficult as far as getting to removals. We all know that budgets are tight and labor is hard to find. So if you leave yourself sitting in these scenarios where you've got a lot of dead trees all at once, it is not great. So the practical concerns around emerald ash borer and tree death is a lot of things. It's multifaceted, but economic, of course, because both treatment and removals cost money. So money makes the world go round. And unfortunately, that is, you know, as much as we'd love to save every tree, that's not possible. And we also just can't leave dead trees standing, which goes into the third bullet point, which is the public safety. As we know with emerald ash borer, once they kill a tree, those trees die and become extremely brittle and extremely susceptible to failure, which obviously is a huge safety concern because lawsuits are not good, and injured people or worse is even worse. The environmental factor is very important as well, just because, I mean, I know Chicagoland saw over 20% ash canopy in certain areas. And as we know that our tree canopy is very important, we get a lot of environmental benefits from trees, you know, carbon sequestration, oxygen, to name a few. The political side of things are always important. We've noticed this over the last 20 years as emerald ash borer has kind of made its way through. Certain administrations within, you know, kind of a city level will definitely dictate what you are able to do and unable to do. Some people care about their public trees, some elected officials care, and some people don't. And we've seen that hugely. I'm going to talk about that a little bit when we get to the case studies. You know, at the end of the day, what's in it for them? Unfortunately, not all of them have trees and the environment in mind. From a homeowner perspective and actually business perspective, this can really be impactful from a property value standpoint. And I'll show you a few photos, but especially in highly urban areas, sometimes the ash tree can be like their only tree, right? Or like their only really nice tree, especially with those cultivars of like those purple white ash trees, those autumn purple white ash trees. People have planted them over the years to be kind of that perfect shade tree. They become beautiful, like gold purple colors in the fall, and people are really looking for that. And if that tree is gone, that changes their yard a lot. And then public health, of course, I think this goes unnoticed, but there's a lot of really cool studies out there to show the impacts of how tree canopies are helpful to our urban environment specifically, but just in general, better for our wellness, better for crime rates, speeding on streets, all sorts of things that just impact our communities overall to maintain our public trees. So some common myths, moving along. Common myths that I still run into on a day-to-day basis that we are really trying to debunk, and we're really trying to get your wheels spinning around how you're going to start to think about managing EAB if and when it comes into your area. Removing trees as they die is a viable EAB management strategy. It's just not, as we saw with that sort of exponential death curve. You can remove trees slowly for a few years, but then all of a sudden you'll have so many, it's typically pretty difficult to keep up with that. Another myth is that tree removal slows EAB spread, which it really doesn't. Just because typically in these areas, there's so many ash trees, they're just going to continue to move to their next food source. Another common myth is that there's only one effective treatment for EAB. That's also not true, depending on the state that you're in, not the physical state, but like where you are in the curve of emerald ash borer. Another common myth is that treatments do not work, that treatments are expensive, that treatments are dangerous, and that treatments are bad for the environment. And these are all not true. We have highly efficacious treatments. We now are to the point where, and I'll talk about this at the end, we are now to the point where it is not overly expensive, and Rich will talk about the cost benefit when he gets into his details. We are now moving into chemistry. We have moved into chemistry that is much, much safer, better for the environment, all that stuff. So I'll talk about this more, but at the end of the day, these are all untrue. Just to highlight really quickly, some of the options that are viable to us. There are some trunk spray options that do work in early stages. I don't have them highlighted here though, because whatever. We're leaning away from spraying very, very large trees, which makes sense because a lot of ash trees can get pretty big. We don't want to do a lot of overhead sprays, but a couple of soil applications do work, especially in early stages or once we're kind of getting over the peak of EAB. So imidacloprid and dinotofuran both work very well and easily as soil applications. Dino can also be used as a bark spray. And then of course, ivermectin benzoate is our trunk injection preferred option. Ivermectin benzoate 4%, I will say, is showing the best efficacy, and that has 2 years of of efficacy, 2 years of control. So pretty good options out there. So perspective from the trenches. I am wearing, if you'll notice in this picture, I am wearing double PPE because we were using restricted use pesticides, and that was one of the requirements. We don't have to do that anymore. Anyway, so I'll give you the timeline background really quick here, which is I entered into the plant health as a plant healthcare technician, a groundsman, and sort of a secondary climber slash, helper with the bucket truck in 2013. So almost 10 years ago. So at this point, we sort of knew what was going on with EAB, but not really. So just as a point of reference to emerald ash borer had been discovered in Chicagoland roughly 2008, and I started in 2013. So as you'll recognize, that's right when we're starting to see like kind of a lot of death, a lot of mortality in ash trees, or a lot of at least trees that are starting to show symptoms as it kind of moved its way around the region. So at that time, we knew about emerald ash borer and about treatments, but there was not any long-term data, right? Because there couldn't be long-term data because it had only been around for a few years. So we knew that some of these products work, so we were recommending them, but we weren't giving any guarantees around longevity or guaranteeing that it was going to work long-term. It was really hard to get budgets and plans in action quickly because although we knew emectin benzoate had efficacy, we didn't know. And at the time, it was extremely expensive and extremely laborious, which I will talk about. We also knew that there was some efficacy working with imidacloprid and dinotefuran, but national press surrounding neonics was prime time so that bee kill with dinotefuran in Wilsonville, Oregon, which is right in my backyard. I live in Portland. Happened, I believe, in 2013. So all of a sudden, one of the options that we were utilizing for treatments was getting a lot of bad press, and we were actually asked within my company to pull it from use until they figured out what was going on. Although that was on linden trees, it was a totally different scenario. It was still a big deal. And as we all know, when something bad happens in the industry, there's a lot of ripple effect and people are very, very cautious, rightfully so. So that was just kind of what it was like. So being on tree crews during this time was pretty difficult. As we all know, any of you guys who have tree care operations or folks that manage the tree crews for your cities, you know that keeping up with the calls is pretty difficult. It is difficult to get buckets where they need to go. You got to kind of go in order as far as hazard, things like that. From my perspective, it impacted our financials. I don't know if that maybe doesn't make sense from a municipal standpoint, but as working for a private tree care company, those sort of like financial numbers that they look at got really skewed by removals. And then sort of at the end of life removals, those got very, very challenging. So they're pretty unsafe. Ash trees are pretty unsafe to climb once they have any symptoms of this. They get very brittle. We saw failures throughout the industry, branch failures, tree climbing incidents as folks tried to do some of these removals just because we didn't know. So it got to the point where we were pretty much only doing floppers or bucket removals. And then, man, some of those backyard trees that you can't get a crane over was pretty bad. Now, actually, though, from your perspective, we've got a lot better technology as far as spider lifts and other cranes with different reaches and buckets that have higher reach, things like that. So maybe it won't be quite so bad for those of you who are not quite there yet, just because we do have a lot more resources, but certainly something to be thinking about. And then I don't know if I have it on the next slide, but I will mention too, at the time I was working for a tree care company, we won, I want to say like a $3 or $4 million removal contract at Humboldt Park, which is a huge park here in Chicago, or over there in Chicago. And I want to say it was something like 9,000, 11,000 ash, something like that for the park district. And it shows up really nice because you've got a lot of removals, you've got guaranteed winter work for your crews, but at the end of the day, the profit margins on stuff like that are pretty low. So anyway, a lot of skew. And then how are you possibly going to sell that equal amount the next year when all the ash are gone, right? So just something to be thinking about. All right, so as a plant healthcare technician, I was working both municipal and private contracts. Back then, tree injections were pretty difficult. There was only really 1 or 2 options, and that those very first iterations of injection equipment were where you had to physically squeeze a little gun into the tree using a plug, and it was pretty labor intensive getting those plugs set and then squeezing those things. Then they finally came up with a few more options as far as like compressed air or higher pressure, things like that, which made the applications a little bit easier. But then we saw, you know, a little bit more issues with doing the applications correctly, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit as well. Additionally, we were using restricted use pesticides. So I remember I had a failure with a piece of equipment, and you know, when that stuff gets on you, then your whole day, you got to run back, you got to get rinsed off, you got to change your clothes, all sorts of stuff. Everything was really slow. So we had pretty poor hourly rates. And because we needed to charge a decent amount, it was pretty hard to win municipal contracts. So the good news is, for those of you who are municipal arborists, you should be able to keep your rates down, because now that we've improved our technology for both chemistries and injections, it goes faster, which means tree care companies who are going to be performing the services, or if you decide to perform them in-house, should actually be able to do these at a very reasonable cost. And in the end, everyone should not have to lose the shirts off their back. All right, so as a sales arborist, so I know people call these different things, but basically a residential commercial arborist selling to clients. I had a few homeowner scenarios and conversations, and I just want to highlight this, even though it's not all, I'm hoping it's mostly municipal people, but if it's not, basically we had 3 highlighted conversations. 1, the tree was already dead or pretty much dying, removal. Some dieback, like 30% or less, you had to talk about the cost benefit with them. Is it worth it to try? Is it not? And I know Rich is going to talk about this from a city level. And then if it was still healthy, go ahead and preventatively treat. Those are pretty easy conversations to have, but that middle one, you really need to set realistic expectations. So yes, sales arborists, municipal contracts, we put a lot of work out to bid for different municipal contracts. We did have a few for treatments. They went relatively well, but like I was saying in that last slide, it was a little bit challenging. And then the pricing conversation, now we've got a really good grasp on things, but back then it was a little bit tricky. I always say it was, you know, we're always promoting the toolbox approach for within plant healthcare and within recommendations of things. Obviously, this is invasive pest, so it doesn't matter how healthy your tree is, still going to be susceptible to EAB. But I lost my train of thought, but basically, oh, hang on. Thank you. Sorry, just got a message. There's some static, so hopefully this is better. But the pricing concerns, the pricing concerns back then, basically we were like kind of recommending lots of things. We're like, we think that all these things will work, but we're not really sure. So here's a bid for all of these things. But so how do you have that conversation, right? Now we know it's a lot better. Okay. I'm just going to highlight a few of the case studies that I kind of was directly involved with. So these 4 cities, City of Chicago and Naperville specifically, were 2 contracts that I worked on directly. And then Mount Prospect and Arlington Heights were both cities that I had conversations with about their protocols. So this is also, I want to say that the most recent update on the data was from last year or the year before. So it's possible that a couple of these things may have changed by now. But at the end of the day, all in the sort of the same place, all had Emerald Ash Borer confirmed around, you know, between 2000, we'll say 6 and 10 roughly. So I'll kind of highlight these. The Village of Arlington Heights, the city chose not to treat any ash trees. They did put out a public awareness program and offered a $50 cost share treatment for their boulevard or parkway trees to slow down the death curve. But basically, that's all they were doing. They were just trying to get a few people to treat, knowing that they were going to have to remove, and they were just trying to slow that curve a little to get into that removal, staging those removals over years. In the end, they had to remove all 13,000 ash trees in their village, and they ended up taking out a loan for $11.5 million to fund those removals. So if you choose to do nothing, this is really what you are looking at. No matter how you try to slow the curve, you're still in, kind of a difficult scenario unless you do it for years and years and actually spend money on that. The city of Chicago, this was my street that I used to live on. Every single one of those trees are ash trees. Please diversify your urban canopies if you have any moments on the planning committees. That's a nightmare. So EAB was confirmed in June of 2008. Before emerald ash borer, the city inventory estimated 85,000 city ash trees and 30,000 private ash trees. So the original city plan was to treat all trees on a 3-year cycle, which I know that we're going to talk about it, but amectin benzoate, 4% shows really great efficacy for 2 full years. That is what you should definitely be recommending for homeowner trees. But if you are a city, for the sake of cost reduction, some cities have utilized this 3-year cycle and then just known that they're going to need to do some removals. So that's what the city had done. They had done 3-year cycles and they knew they were still going to have to remove some. So they evaluated for removal as needed. So that contract was continuing to go. I was a part of that on some of those treatments. And then as of 2020, there was a large change in changing of the guard, right? So the political regime had changed with the mayorship as well as all the committees, stuff like that. Nobody knew what was going on. I'm not saying that whatever the new mayor didn't care about trees. It was just that all the committees got transitioned over and they didn't really know what was going on. They were moving budget money around. And basically they decided to cut the budget for ash treatments. So as of 2020, the plan was that no more ash trees will be treated by the city. The homeowners are now responsible to treat their parkway trees if they are interested in saving them, and that any trees will just be removed as they die. There was a decent amount of backlash, but then of course it was the pandemic. So I think it was kind of hard for folks to make changes. But as of last year, they did announce a new coalition. I had some urban forestry coalition within the city. So I know folks like Open Lands, they're a big nonprofit in Chicago, as well as a couple of the tree canopy initiatives were finding places to form this coalition to hopefully protect some of the remaining trees. But I don't have the most recent update on that. But that's a lot of city trees to lose. I'll just say that. Okay. The one thing to note here too, and you may notice this, is that your park and rec department or your streets and sanitation department are different but still manage trees. In this scenario, the city of Chicago Park District did remove and replace all of their trees. That was the removal contract that I was on. So it was 13,000 ash trees in city of Chicago Park District. It's a lot of trees. I didn't do all of the removals, but a lot. Village of Mount Prospect, they had almost 2,000 ash trees. They decided to remove 919 of them, and then they chose 800 legacy trees. So they identified it based on the value of the trees, where they were located, structure, etc. They had pretty good foresight. They had obtained several grants to help cover the cost of inventory, removals, and replacement of those 900 trees that were lost. And then as of last year, when I spoke with someone at Mount Prospect, they said that almost all the legacy trees were still alive and were still being treated, obviously with the exception of a few here and there. Trees still die regardless. And of course, some with branch failures, things like that, storm damage. But I consider that's a pretty good success story in my opinion. The city of Naperville, they were sort of on the cutting edge of treatment plans. So 15,000 trees roughly to be treated starting in 2012. They removed 1,400 for structural reasons, whatever thing. This is a good opportunity to call some of your more poor trees. And since then, they have maintained all of the treatments on their trees and just maintenance removals as needed. So again, like that's a pretty aggressive but awesome success story. All of these tree canopies were around 10% ash trees, just for reference. So it is a substantial amount of tree canopy. They also had a big incentive to put out kind of information. So back then, they used a lot of ads in the paper and headline news in the paper. They sent out a lot of mailings and things. They put together this whole thing of qualified vendors. And I would highly recommend that anyone here that works for a city, maybe you determine within your specs what equipment can be used, what products can be used, and if there are specific vendors that people should go to for their private trees or to help, that cost share kind of component with having homeowners treat their parkway trees. Ryan Spencer is going to be talking a little bit about that later. And we at Rainbow definitely have some capacity to help with those things. I know Eric has worked a lot on bid specs, so please reach out to us if you need assistance with some of this stuff. So at the end of the day, how do you get municipalities to treat? You create a management plan, education and outreach. And what I will say is it's 2022 now. So you don't have to put ads in the paper. You don't have to mail things to people. You can use social media. You can use the internet. You can use email with highly extensive amounts of success. I mean, this is just really, really important, getting people educated on these things and then doing some education outreach that includes private citizens, any of your decision makers. So your city councils, your mayors, whatever sort of structure you have, any of your public officials. Inventory and assessment. So I was just talking to the city of Berkeley yesterday. They don't have a lot of ash trees, but you know what they don't have also? An inventory. And I think this is pretty common. So please, please, please try to get inventories if you know that you live in an ash populated area, so you can define the scope of your problem and establish a conversation. Part of what can come into play too is writing ordinance around these. So part of it is, finding money. So kind of thinking about where that budget is going to come from. Maybe it's grants, maybe it's something, but you can also write ordinances now that can help get you prepared for a few years down the road when you get EAB. And then come up with a management plan, work on your decision-making. I obviously know that that's easier said than done. Treatments, which again, I know Rich is going to talk about a little bit, but basically, if you want to save trees, establish what chemicals, what rates, and what equipment you're going to use. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but we've got awesome options out there. And then maybe there is a component where you do kind of just treat some trees for short amounts of time, so you can stage for removals for a later budget cycle. And that's perfectly viable. And then what that allows you to do is hopefully replace some of your canopy and allow that to kind of grow in, so you're not losing quite so much at one time. But as we know, no small tree ever really replaces a large canopy. Even in our lifetime, that's not going to be it can't happen. It physically cannot happen. And then the last option is to talk about removals and replacements. So if you only have a few ash trees, maybe that is your option. So the then versus now conversation, I definitely want to take a little bit of time on this. So then versus now, and I mean then as in, early 2000s through, let's just call it, early 2010, 2012, whatever. There is a lack of consensus among scientists. So back then it was still just kind of like, some of this stuff is working, but as we know, scientists don't really approve of anecdotal evidence. They can say like, oh, that looks like it might be working, but until you have quantifiable data, you're not going to ever get a consensus among scientists. But now, since we've got 20 years of data and information, we have consensus. We also have a coalition for urban ash tree conservation. This is many, many states from the extension agencies from many states around the country have statements and information out there. That even includes, there's some documentation that, look this up, has some of the municipal bid specs and recommendations. So we're in a much better place. Lack of knowledge. So I know that this happens basically with any new invasive pest. I personally am working on a lot of stuff with South American palm weevil, but people who don't have palms don't know and they don't care. So there is just a lack of knowledge for other arborists in the rest of the country with what's going on with that. That was the same thing with EAB. It was hitting the Midwest. Other people were like, nah, not my problem. But now everyone knows that we have lost hundreds of millions of ash trees, and it's a big deal. Of course, there is no real long-term data because, again, you can't have long-term data if it's only been around for a few years. But now we've got about, 2 decades worth. Best management practices. So again, as we know, tree injection has been around for a really long time. So I'm going to highlight the tree injection component of this. Has been around for as early as Leonardo da Vinci, but really has not been highly utilized until EAB. Like EAB is really what has sparked kind of the progression of tree injection. Of course, we've been doing treatment for Dutch elm disease since the 70s, and we know that we've got some reliable results using tree injection for Dutch elm disease. But other than that, not a whole lot out there. So we have now an ISA tree injection best management practice book that was published in 2015, and that also includes a section for municipal bid specs. And then there actually was just a updated, reviewed second edition this year. It just came out, and Eric Lindberg and I were both editors on that. So pick up a copy of this from ISA, especially if you're thinking about getting into tree injection. It does matter. But basically, back then, bids had a wide range in prices. I mean, you would see like up from a per inch cost, you could see something as, for the same treatment, something as low as $5 an inch to $35 an inch. So obviously within the industry, we want to be getting that hopefully honed in a little bit more. Some of the first products, they didn't have any dosage rates stated. They didn't have any timing specified. There was no application procedure specified. There was no requirement for contractors to map or locate any of their trees. So now it's like, map your trees, put them in GIS. We've got all this technology, identify what you're going to use, how you're going to do the treatments, all of that stuff. So we have lots and lots of resources and information on this now. The beautiful thing about Emerald Ash Borer is that, I will say this is my silver lining, is that it really has allowed us to work to be on the cutting edge of technology to improve our chemistries, to be safer, and to be more efficacious and faster, better, all those things. And same with equipment. So from a product side, and actually I need to change this because then the very first iterations had restricted use warning labels on them. Now we've got unrestricted and caution labels, so much safer for the applicator. We have changed some of the formulations. So from high viscosity, which is similar to, kind of like a thick maple syrup. I always say it was like trying to inject a tree with maple syrup that had been in the fridge, which, if you know, that is thick. And now it's lower viscosity. So almost like gasoline or something. When you shake it in the container, you can tell that it moves. It's not just sticking to the sides. We've gone from oil-based products to more water-based products, which obviously is helpful with cleanup as well as uptake. So very slow uptake times to very fast uptake times. The equipment has also been able to come a long way. So back then, because the chemistry was so thick, you had to use plugs. There was really no other choice. You had to set a plug, you would inject that product basically behind the plug, and then it would kind of sit there in that little reservoir and then get taken up as you left the property. It was a way to keep that product in there. But now, since the product can move so much more quickly, we can move towards plugless options. And then back then also, we were really set on using high pressure. So over 300 PSI or higher in some circumstances, using compressed air. And what I didn't say earlier is from a user standpoint, that's fine if you live on the coast and you got a lot of scuba shops, but this was all happening in the Midwest. So of course it would always be on the last day, Friday, last day job of the day, and you'd have to drive 40 minutes to the only scuba shop or paintball shop to go get compressed air to fill your device to get that done. So there's a lot of hiccups involved with those systems. But now we've got lower pressure systems that you can utilize with something like a bike pump or some other pump systems that are just lower pressure and easier to obtain. A bike pump you can get at Walgreens or Target or anywhere. You don't have to go to a specialized store for that. A quick plug for plugless technology. And this is not a commercial for this, but I'm going to show you on the next slide. And we do have Dr. Hauer coming. So basically, here's the thing. At the end of the day, anytime you drill, you are wounding a tree. You are forcing that tree to have to compartmentalize. However, technology for both equipment and chemistry has improved to make the plug unnecessary for emerald ash borer treatments. There may be a time and a place for different types of treatments, but I'm talking strictly EAB in this circumstance. This has been a PR problem for a few cities. And the reason why is that plugs are hard to set. So any of you who have ever set plugs, I did this on thousands and thousands of trees. You have to drill perfectly, and then you have to tap your plug perfectly. So that's 2 steps. It can be a little bit tricky. And I would consider myself a pretty good plant healthcare applicator, and I would still see plugs that were too deep, plugs that were not quite deep enough when I was doing these applications myself. So there's just a lot of room for human error. This has been a PR problem. The city of Quincy, that's in Illinois, they contracted a tree care company to do all of their ash tree treatments. And basically they ended up not setting their plugs correctly. And basically they saw bark separation and vascular damage to all of every single one of their trees. It sounds like they just had an applicator that didn't know what they were doing. But basically you can see those just like gaping wounds and areas that are trying to compartmentalize. That's a lot of wounding on a lot of trees. You will inevitably end up with some structural damage over time because those trees will not all be able to compartmentalize all of those wounds. Plus, if you think about if it's bad enough, basically you've kind of like girdled the entire base of the tree. So just be mindful. And then the newest data that's come out, which I'm so excited that Dr. Rich Hauer is coming right behind me. I think he will probably mention this, but a new wounding study out by Dr. Rich Hauer, Dr. John Fall, Dr. Frederick Miller, Dr. Eric North, some of our biggest names in the EAB world, if you've been paying attention at all, have been doing some studies on trees to see what they look like now that they have been treated on multiple cycles. So sealed systems versus open systems. So plug system versus non-plug systems. But basically the data was pretty compelling. In those sealed systems, we saw 50% of trees had at least one wound versus the open system, only about 12% of trees had one wound, at least one wound. So the sealed system was 7 times more likely to have damage. Mostly it was associated with improper plug setting. So like I said, large possibility for user error there, and that is coming through in the statistics. So I will let Dr. Hauer answer specific questions, but I think that's also still being written. This is still just the preliminary data set. So please keep an eyeball out for that. But I do think that it is important. We now have data and we now have information, so we need to use it. All right, our overall lessons learned. We know that treatments work. We know that emamectin benzoate 4% works to keep a tree alive for 2 years to protect it from emerald ash borer very, very well. We have a better idea of cost and duration of treatments. And I'm going to preemptively answer this because this comes up every time. How do you know how long you have to keep treating an ash tree? We don't know yet. We have trees that are on cycles of 2-year treatments that have been on those since 2010. So we're looking at now 6 rounds of treatments on some of those. But I know Dr. Cliff Sadoff out of Purdue has been saying that once you kind of get past that carrying capacity and then the emerald ash borers start to fall out, you can switch back to some of our soil applications and still have really good success. So maybe we can switch over to those so we're not doing doing as much injection damage. And then we'll see what ends up happening with EAB, if we see a resurgence or if they end up actually moving out of areas. I don't know that we know yet. I'm sure someone has speculations, but I'm not going to be the person to do that. Anyway, overall lessons learned, we've got better products and better equipment. We just know a lot more. So please do not reinvent the wheel. We are here to help you. SMA is here to help you. There's lots and lots of resources out there. So without further ado, this is my contact information. If you have any questions, I'm gonna stop sharing and see what we've got. All right.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Just go ahead and pull up the Q&A. There's a question here, I believe meant ash. If an ash gets struck by lightning, does it kill the borers?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think it probably depends. So if lightning strike moves through the vascular tissue, right where the larvae are feeding, I would assume those would probably die, but I do not know about lightning and its killing capacity, though I would not recommend that as a treatment strategy. Also, though, when you're thinking about lightning, you're probably looking at a lot of other different things as far as hazard and whatnot. But also be aware that if it did kill all the larvae, it would only be for a little bit.
Yeah, and most likely once it kills all the larvae, there's going to be a plethora of structural damage associated with it. So.
Exactly.
But that's a good question. Another one, what are your opinions on the parasitic wasp to control EAB? I just heard of this. I'm concerned of the environmental implications of introducing a new non-native wasp species.
Yeah, that's a great question. Dr. Frederick Miller actually has been working on a lot of this stuff. I think that using all of these strategies in conjunction with one another is a great idea. That certainly is technically the toolbox. I don't deal with a lot of parasitic wasps. I know that they have identified that it is relatively safe, right? They do all the lab studies to see if it's going to impact other species of things. And they have done quite a few releases. I don't think that they've seen any negative implications, but yes, using biocontrol certainly is really cool. There are really good opportunities. We've seen really great options, but yes, you are 100% correct to be concerned. Like I said, it is not my bread and butter. So I'm hoping that the experts who are experting in that are going to give us the good recommendations. So there are not negative implications to our environment. Yeah, but it's still a cool option. I want anybody who's on here is exploring biocontrol. I think it's cool. The only issue is that biocontrol, they don't stay where you put them. So
yeah. Another person was wanting to, can you define what an arborologist is?
Yeah, so arborologist is a fake word. I am an arborist, but I also, since I do a lot of research and development and kind of hands-on training, and I sort of the science communication, our company has made up this word. It's as the arborologist. Oh, John, yay. Thank you, John. City of Arlington Heights still has about 3,000 ash left. I love that. I'll update my slide.
And could you expand on the relative safety of some of the treatments that you talked about? Interested in the aspect of non-target insects that are impacted.
Yeah, totally. So first and foremost, first and foremost, like sort of permethrin sprays that have been used as trunk sprays in the very early days, it does kill borers. We know that from other types of borers, but as we know, that literally kills everything it touches, which is kind of why we've tried to move away from that. Imidacloprid and dinotefuran, those are the two sort of soil and or bark, dino can be used as bark spray. Those are the two that are kind of being used as soil apps. They are both neonicotinoids. So there are certainly implications for pollinators on a large scale. That being said, as a soil application, they should really only be going into the ash trees, which as we know are wind pollinated and don't have a lot of pollinator, native bee pollinator activity. But that being said, yes, there is always potential for, off-target issues. And then I was actually just talking to one of the bee experts out in Colorado, and certain bees do have ground nests. So it is possible that those have, those soil applications could have impacts on those bee ground nests too. So definitely not without warrant. And then the reason ivermectin benzoate has kind of become the front runner is A, it provides 2 years of control. B, it's directly injected into the tree. And C, it does have less implication on our pollinators because it is not a neonicotinoid and it is going straight into the tree, again, when pollinated, not heavily pollinated on that perspective. So I think that was a question. Was there concern around? Okay, cool.
Yep, and with that as well, with the active ingredient ivermectin benzoate, it's a relatively larger active ingredient compared to dinotefuran or imidacloprid. Yep. And so for that, they're not really detecting it in the pollen of those ash trees. And so when they've done some studies with bees coming to the ash trees, as Allison had indicated, is predominantly wind pollinated, but when they do come there for trees treated with ivermectin benzoate, it's not impacting their foraging behavior.
Good to know. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, Eric knows a lot about that stuff. Okay.
So we'll probably do 2 more questions and then we'll get over to Ridges.
Okay.
Are people considering planting ash species from the regions where EAB is native as replacements?
Planting ash where? Okay. I don't understand. Are people considering planting ash species from regions where EAB is native? Oh,
China over.
China. Oh, yeah. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. I think most places are trying to just not plant ash, period. Though I saw a huge ash installation in Oregon, so I don't know.
I can say, I can speak to Frederick Miller with some of his work at the Morton Arboretum in conjunction with Aaron McMahon a couple of years ago, was looking at the relative susceptibility to EAB across a whole wide variety of Fraxinus species. I don't know what that data looks like off the top of my head, but they found different levels of kind of how emerald ash borer is going to impact. So there are going to be certain species that may be more resistant per se to emerald ash borer relative to others, but I'm not sure where the relative location of those are.
Cool. All right. I will answer the rest of these questions. I'll type the rest of these questions so we can move along so Dr. Hauer has ample time. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Allison.